Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Santa Barbara is in many ways home for us. My wife Arlene graduated from Westmont. I graduated from UC Santa Barbara. So this is the first time that we've lived together in Santa Barbara, so this is a pleasure for us to be here. This is a wonderful series. It's my first time to be a part of this downtown series, but it's a series that Westmont has developed as a way of giving back to the community some of the richness of intellectual life on our campus, and we very much enjoy these sessions where we explore issues and ideas of great contemporary relevance, and we're delighted at the turnout today to look at an issue on national and global security. We have two very fine faculty members from Westmont who will be sharing perspectives, and then we'll have some time for question and answer following that. I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker. Tom Knecht is an associate professor in the political science department at Westmont. He received his doctorate from UC Santa Barbara in 2004. He came to Westmont in 2009 after spending 5 years at the University of Denver. And his research examines the role of public opinion in U.S. foreign policy. In fact, he recently published a book on the subject, Paying Attention to Foreign Affairs. So please welcome Tom Knecht as he shares our first presentation today. Tom?
My mentor in graduate school once described the job of a political scientist this way. He says, "We take inherently interesting subject matter and we make it insufferably boring." And so I think there's a lot of really interesting things that we can discuss about Robert Gates and recent American foreign policy. I think probably foremost in most of your minds are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think they're important, they're interesting, but I think those are probably conflicts that you've thought a lot about, you've heard a lot about. So in the attempt to maybe explore some new territory and at the risk of being insufferably boring, which I'm going to try not to do, but that's kind of my character. I don't want to be boring, but I might be, so I apologize in advance. I want to look at a different question. And so the question is, how much does Robert Gates, the individual, really matter? And this question taps into a broad debate in political science between individualist and institutionalist scholars. Individualist scholars argue that if you want to know a policy decision, the reason for it, you have to look at the decision makers that actually make the policy. You have to kind of know what makes them tick. So you look at decision makers' cognitive processes, you look at their emotional state, you look at their worldview, but you really have to know who's making the decisions to really understand American foreign policy. Institutionalists say you don't. You really don't. That you can kind of figure out how people behave by the context that they occupy. That people generally behave as they are incentivized or coerced to behave, and there's not a whole lot of variation in behavior. So we can learn policy decisions without having to know the individual. I'm generally of the institutionalist school, but I think in many ways Robert Gates is important to understand from an individual perspective. And I think it's fair to say that he is a unique, transformative Secretary of Defense, that if he didn't break the mold of a secretary, I think he at least bent it in some pretty important ways. And so, therefore, I think we do need to look at Robert Gates, the individual. At the same token, I'm not willing to abandon entirely an institutionalist perspective. And I think in other ways we can understand Robert Gates behaving in a manner that we would expect secretaries of state to behave. So in my talk today, I'm going to look at three main issues as they pertain to Secretary Gates. His appointment as Secretary of Defense, his budgets, and his vision for American foreign policy. And for each of these issues, I'm going to examine his legacy from both an individualist and an institutionalist perspective. So first, his appointment. I think the most obviously unique thing about Robert Gates is that he served under both a Republican and a Democratic president. And this is unique for three reasons. First, it's never been done before. There's never been a Secretary of Defense that has served under two different partisan administrations. Secondly, his appointment in the Obama administration, even the Bush administration, took place in an era of hyper-partisanship. The parties are further apart in ideological space now than they ever have been. And Washington seems to find no middle ground of compromise. And so the fact that Robert Gates stayed on as a holdover as the administrations changed, I think is pretty remarkable. The final reason that it's interesting is kind of flows from the second, is that presidents use their appointment power as a way to further their political agenda. And the story goes like this. Presidents need the bureaucracy in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. But they often find that cooperation of the bureaucracy is difficult to achieve. Most of the executive branch is civil service, about 98%. And these are people that hold their job regardless of who the president is. They may not necessarily agree with the president's agenda. They might be of a different party. And so somehow presidents need to get these people on board to accomplish what they want to accomplish. Truman noted the difficulty of working with the bureaucracy. He was leaving office, Eisenhower was coming in, and Truman said, poor Ike, he'll sit here and say, do this and do that, and nothing will get done. It'll drive him nuts. So the bureaucracy is tough to deal with, and presidents typically try to work and manage the bureaucracy through their appointment power. Presidents are able to appoint cabinet-level officials and some people under them. And the key here is that presidents try to appoint people who see problems the same way and are loyal to them. And the analogy that I'd like to use is that the appointment process is like trying to graft a small 2% head onto a gigantic pre-existing civil service body and get the body to do what you want to do. It's a tough, tough task. So the appointment process is key for the president to try to control what the bureaucracy does or does not do. And so here's why it matters. Presidents don't often appoint people that come from a different political philosophy than they do. They don't often appoint people who are of a different party than they are. And so I think the fact that Robert Gates served in two very, very different presidential administrations is unique, but it also says a lot about him as an individual, that he was considered trustworthy, he was considered competent, he was considered somebody who had the best interest of the United States in mind rather than some sort of narrow partisan agenda that he was trying to push through. So this raises a question, are we likely to see it again? Are we going to see any kind of bipartisan cabinet sometime in the future? This possibility was raised by David Gergen, who's a CNN commentator, presidential advisors for 4 different administrations, and he gave a talk at UCSB a couple months ago. And somebody asked him, well, how do we get around this bipartisan, or this, hyper-partisanship in Washington, D.C.? How do we kind of solve this? Is there any way of kind of finding some middle ground? And Gergen said, a coalitional government. So presidents, when they come in, they should appoint people who are good at their job, regardless of whether they're a Democrat or Republican. So their staff, their cabinet officials, it should be kind of a bipartisan flavor. I thought that was interesting, but the institutionalist in me said, fat chance. I don't think it's going to happen. I think people like Robert Gates are going to be rare because the political needs of presidents, I think, are simply going to trump other considerations. And that presidents have an ideological position that's usually met best with somebody from their own party, and they have an incentive to appoint loyal people to key cabinet posts. So, in kind of summary of the first point, I think an individual scholar would say that we have to look at Robert Gates, the individual, to see why he was appointed in both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And institutionalists would simply say Gates was the exception. Most appointees are going to be strong and loyal partisans. All right, so this brings me to the second point, budgets. I think Gates's budgets as the Secretary of Defense are pretty interesting. He cut the defense budget in his last year. He slashed about 31 different defense programs, including some pretty high-profile systems like the F-22 Raptor, the Marine Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. And this is unique because it violates a cardinal rule of bureaucratic policymaking as a secretary, is that you spend all of your budget and you cry poor. You just don't give money back to the federal government. And so there's not a whole lot of incentive for secretaries to trim fat, but the simple fact that Gates made these cuts, I think, kind of makes him a unique secretary. It's more unique in that he got the cuts through Congress. Congress is the branch that authorizes military programs and provides the money. And history is absolutely littered with examples of presidents and secretaries of defense who have tried to cut defense programs only for Congress to say, you're taking them. So I think the V-22 Osprey is a good case in point. V-22 Osprey is a tilt-rotor aircraft. It can take off and land vertically like a helicopter. Once it's airborne, it can fly like a prop plane. The Marines use it. But the V-22 Osprey has been on the chopping block for over 25 years. People have been trying to cut the V-22 Osprey. Dick Cheney, when he was Secretary of Defense under George Herbert Walker Bush, tried really hard to cut the Osprey, said it was dangerous, too costly, redundant, had the annoying tendency of crashing. But Congress basically said, no, you're going to take it. Really because providing that kind of defense spending gives jobs to and money to local districts, and so there's an incentive for Congress to spend. So the fact that Gates was able to cut some defense programs that were really sacred cows, I think says quite a bit about him and the respect that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have of Secretary Gates. So I do think, though, that there is a limit, and in other ways, I think Secretary Gates acted as we would expect other defense secretaries to act. Although Gates did cut the budget in his last year of the Pentagon, the size of the Department of Defense increased throughout his tenure, and the cuts that he made are relatively small, about $20 billion, compared to the size of the defense budget, which is about $660 billion to $700 billion. Moreover, the cuts, about $20 billion of savings, are the proverbial drop in the bucket when we're talking about trillion-dollar deficits. So even though cuts were made, these are not necessarily deep cuts. The United States still accounts for about half the defense spending in the entire world. You know, the military is not shrinking away. Gates was once asked, why do we need 11 aircraft carriers? We have 11 aircraft carriers. No other country has more than one. In fact, we're building a new aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford. It'll be completed in 2015. It would have been completed earlier, but it fell down some stairs. That was okay. No? All right. So Gates was asked about, why do we have so many aircraft carriers? Nobody else has them. And he said, well, I may be bold, but I'm not stupid. And I think that's more of a political statement than it is reflecting of some sort of strategic reality, that cutting an aircraft carrier would be unbelievably difficult, nay, impossible, given the politics of this country. Strategically, it's certainly debatable whether we need one more aircraft carrier. So in some sense, I think Robert Gates acted as a normal Secretary of State would act in terms of protecting the budgets. So finally, his vision of American foreign policy, and Susan will speak more to this issue, but I think his vision was fairly unique. Robert Gates warned of a creeping militarism. He stressed the importance of diplomacy, good governance, and building what he called partner capacity, which is helping other countries help themselves. And to this end, he recommended that the State Department be bolstered. He envisioned a world in which military force was only one part of the broader toolkit that the United States uses in international affairs. Again, this is kind of unique. It violates the old adage of bureaucratic politics, is where you stand is where you sit. That if you are the Secretary of Defense, then every solution to every problem is defense. You know, I'm big fan of old adages, but the other adage is, if you only have a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So, it's not often that you have a Secretary of Defense advocating that we need to spend more time in diplomacy. And Gates, I think, stands in marked contrast to Donald Rumsfeld on this account. Donald Rumsfeld, his predecessor, didn't have a whole lot of time for issues of counterinsurgency or in diplomacy, and certainly did not like the State Department. And so here, I think maybe we see the clearest indication of an individualist perspective, that there is a huge difference between Don Rumsfeld and Bob Gates when it comes to their view of what American foreign policy is and ought to be. But although Gates should get credit, and I think rightfully so, for reorganizing the DoD, putting greater emphasis on counterinsurgency strategies, I still don't think there was a fundamental shift in the pecking order of bureaucratic institutions. The DoD still leads. We still use force as a means of policy, probably first. And even though he advocated the State Department play an increasing role in American foreign policy, he didn't advocate a cut in DoD funds to give to the state. So, and Susan will talk about this a little bit more, and this is more in her wheelhouse, but I think there's a real question about, for all the shift to counterinsurgency strategy, has it made a whole lot of difference? Do we see people in war-torn regions that like us better? And I think that's an open question that even now we're debating whether these things have actually worked. Are they effective? And again, this is much more Susan's area of expertise than my own. So in summary, I think Robert Gates was arguably one of the more important secretaries of defense. I think he bucked the institutional perspectives arguably more than anybody else, and that includes his budget, his appointment, and his vision. And I also think it's important to recognize that he served in one of the more challenging periods of American foreign policy history. He inherited 2 wars that were going very poorly. He took office in a time of massive budget deficits. The civil-military relations in this country were almost at their all-time low. And all of this in a context of hyper-partisanship, where Democrats and Republicans can't seem to agree on much of anything. I couldn't imagine a more difficult context for a man to take over as Secretary of Defense. And the fact that he's done so well and so widely respected across the political aisle, I think says a lot about him as an individual. Still, as we've heard throughout the talk, there are some things in which he acted as other secretaries before him, and probably other secretaries to come have acted. In sum, I'm really excited to hear him speak on March 2nd at the President's Breakfast. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate that. Our second speaker is Susan Penksa, who is professor and chair of the Political Science Department at Westmont. She's also the senior associate at the Institute for European Studies in Brussels, Belgium, and an international security and development consultant. Among her consulting projects are overseas work in Belgium, in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Pakistan. Dr. Penksa's publications and presentations focus on security, international crisis management, civil-military relations, security system reform, and gender as a cross-cutting issue of security and development. In 2007, she received a Fulbright Scholar appointment to Bosnia, and in 2010 had that Fulbright Scholarship renewed. Most recently, Dr. Penksa has co-authored a book entitled The European Union in Global Security, The Politics of Impact. It will be released very soon, next month actually, by Palgrave Macmillan Publishers. She is also currently contributing to a study on post-conflict military reform for the U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Penksa. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to return to the Westmont Downtown Series. And It's fabulous to have my first opportunity to share a venue with Tom. So we're looking forward to having a chance to explore some of these issues at greater length in the question and answer period with you. What I want to do is build on the excellent overview that Tom has provided on national security and the legacy of Secretary Gates, and then broaden our focus to global security issues. In particular, I'd like to focus on some themes related to civil-military cooperation, the relationship between security and development, and the changing nature of power. Over the last 10 years, I've given many lectures and speeches on global security, most of which focus on the lessons of international interventions and draw significantly from the overseas research and consulting work I've been doing. And in many of these venues, I've used the same quote to capture the complexity of security in the 21st century. So I'd actually like to begin by using this quote. So as I read it, try to decide, who do you think has said it? When is it from? Security is today far more than a military matter. The strengthening of political consultation and economic cooperation, the development of resources, progress in education, and public understanding, all these can be as important or even more important for the protection of the security of a nation as the building of a battleship or the equipping of an army. These two aspects, civil and military, can no longer be safely considered in watertight compartments, either within or between nations. Perhaps we have not yet fully recognized their essential interrelationship or done enough. Now, I think this quote sounds like something we might have heard from Secretary Gates during his tenure in office. It seems to echo many of the themes that Tom has emphasized. It could be from any of a number of scholars on global security who are currently publishing, and it could be from current US administration officials. However, the quote isn't from Secretary Gates or even from a decade ago. It's from 1956. It's from a NATO declaration that was written in the early years of the Cold War. And the NATO declaration was focused on the non-military aspects of security. Now, I discovered this quote in the early 1990s going through NATO archives and used it in my PhD dissertation. And I've continued to use it in speaking venues in Brussels, actually speaking at NATO, at the European Parliament. And many NATO officials have been surprised to hear this quote again. It's one that's been used a little bit, but not as frequently as I think it should be used. It's no secret that security encompasses a range of complex, interdependent issues, that guaranteeing security requires more than just the military instrument, and that global security, and hence national security, depends on cooperation among many different actors, domestic agencies, states, non-governmental organizations, international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, and non-state actors. In fact, most international conflicts are not resolved using the military instrument. Most conflicts do not produce violence. And as Joshua Goldstein has persuasively demonstrated in his new book, the international community is, quote, winning the war on war with the decline of armed conflict worldwide. But we actually wouldn't know this if we were only reading the headlines in the newspapers. In a globalized world where conflicts and crises in one part of the world spill over and affect states in other regions, global security requires utilizing all of the instruments available to state actors and the successful application of what Joseph Nye refers to as so-called smart power strategies. Let me read a quote from his book on smart power. Smart power is the combination of the hard power of coercion and payment with the soft power of persuasion and attraction. The ability to get the outcomes we want will rest upon a new narrative of smart power. Americans will need to stop asking questions about dominance and start asking questions about how the various tools of power can be combined with smart strategies for power, with rather than merely over nations. And so Nye's building upon many of the same themes that we've heard from Secretary Gates. More than the threat of conventional attack from other states, today's threats are more asymmetrical in nature. They emanate from problems such as transnational crime, terrorism, civil wars, failing and failed states, natural disasters, climate change, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, poverty and inequality. Such security challenges can't be solved by one state acting alone or by one military instrument. I'll read to you a series of quotes from Secretary Gates which affirm these basic propositions, as well as this 1956 NATO declaration that I've read to you. In Secretary Gates' 2007 lecture at Kansas State University, he said, "I am here to make the case for strengthening our capacity to use soft power and for better integrating it with hard power. One of the most important lessons of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that military success is not sufficient to win. Economic development, institution building, the rule of law, promoting internal reconciliation, good governance, providing basic services to the people, training and equipping indigenous military and police forces, strategic communications, and more. These, along with security, are essential ingredients for long-term success." Secretary Gates emphasizes the non-military aspects of security, and I think this is remarkably consonant with this 1956 NATO declaration. Then, in his 2008 Global Leadership Campaign lecture series, Secretary Gates contended that, quote, "Repeating in Afghanistan or Iraq, forced regime change followed by nation building under fire. This is probably unlikely in the foreseeable future." He went on to acknowledge the problems associated with the, quote, "creeping militarization of America's foreign policy," that it's important that the military is and is clearly seen to be in a supporting role to civilian agencies, and that, quote, "the Foreign Service is not the Foreign Legion. The United States military should never be mistaken for the Peace Corps with guns." This blunt, honest critique of U.S. foreign policy from the new U.S. Defense Secretary was crucial to restoring America's standing in the international community after the tension over the war in Iraq. And by extension, it was also crucial to enhancing the legitimacy and credibility of Secretary Gates. In 2011, he went further, and he explicitly condemned the folly of waging two simultaneous large-scale land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In his 2011 U.S. Military Academy speech, he said that in his opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined, as General MacArthur so delicately put it. Then, in his last speech as defense secretary, he urged all NATO countries to make a serious effort to protect defense budgets from being further gutted due to economic austerity measures, bluntly telling our NATO partners that the U.S. will have increasing difficulty sustaining support for NATO if, quote, "the American taxpayer continues to carry most of the burden in the alliance, that future U.S. political leaders, those for whom the Cold War was not the formative experience, they may not consider the return on America's involvement in NATO worth the cost." Now, I was in Brussels in 2011 in June when he gave this speech, and let me assure you that everyone in the halls of NATO and the EU were speaking about Secretary Gates' wake-up call to our NATO allies, especially in light of recent speeches that indicated that the U.S. would increasingly be engaging in Asia. So there was a palpable concern that the U.S. was going to turn away from Europe if Europe couldn't get its act together. So to sum up this first part of my lecture, there are common themes that emerge in Secretary Gates' speeches on global security. He openly has criticized the underfunding of American diplomacy and aid programs and the militarization of American foreign policy, advocating that the military play a supportive role to civilian agencies. He emphasizes a future and present of asymmetrical threats, not conventional threats. He stresses the importance of international institutions and multilateral cooperation, of, quote, "building trust and credibility over time." He candidly admits that the international military effort in Afghanistan has suffered from a lack of focus, resources, and attention, and that this situation was exacerbated by America's primary focus on Iraq for most of the past decade. He's highlighted the foreign policy decision-making dysfunction in the United States government bureaucracy, while also calling on our NATO allies to do their fair share of burden sharing most famously in this 2011 NATO speech, telling Europe that it must, quote, get its defense institutions and security relationships on track. He argues that the most dangerous threats to security are from failing states that cannot meet the basic needs and aspirations of their populations, that we need to, quote, work with and through local governments to avoid the next insurgency, to rescue the next failing state, or to head off the next humanitarian disaster. Like any policymaker, Secretary Gates often struggled with maintaining consistency. While he criticized the militarization of U.S. foreign policy and eliminated some defense programs like the F-22, he also rallied against cuts in defense spending within Congress. Tom has covered many of these individual and bureaucratic issues at length, so I want to expand a bit more on some of the global security views that Secretary Gates has highlighted. Among the scholarly, practitioner, and policymaking communities, there is this agreement for an improved need for civil-military cooperation. There's also consensus on the indivisible link between security and development and the need for executing a comprehensive approach to responding to conflicts and crises. Providing security means that states often have to utilize multiple instruments in a non-sequential manner, meaning we have to draw on diplomacy, civilian instruments, the military, intelligence capacity, judicial and police capabilities. And none of this is linear. It's not as if when you respond to a crisis, there's a way to just do this in a successive way that enables each instrument to respond at a precise moment, to do their bit, and then not have contact with the other instruments that are involved. And that's what clearly was so evident in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that there was dysfunction within many of the member states, within their own bureaucracy. And then this dysfunction was extended to the field, where you had all of these international organizations and states trying to mount a comprehensive response, but not having any decision-making mechanisms in place in which to mount a comprehensive response. And I think that point is well illustrated if we look at international interventions in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. All of these interventions would underscore that there can't be security without justice, that there can't be development without security, and that a comprehensive approach is vital. All of this is really easy to say rhetorically. It's a lot harder to implement. And I think that's why the 1956 NATO Declaration is something that we've continued to struggle with throughout the period of the Cold War, as well as in the post-9/11 order. It's easy to say that we need a close civil-military relationship. It's much harder to put into practice. One of the phrases that many policymakers will say is that everyone touts the virtue of coordination, but no one wants to be coordinated. Right? So we can say, oh yeah, we need more coordination, but don't tell my organization how to do their work. Don't tell me how to spend my resources. Don't tell me what type of programs to put into place. And if I'm duplicating what you're doing, don't try to tell me that your outcomes are better than my program's outcomes and that I should actually close up shop. So all of these tensions are apparent if we look within national capitals. Washington, Paris, Berlin, London, and in certain capitals to a greater degree than other capitals. I actually think the British have done a fairly good job of reforming their decision-making apparatus in ways that we haven't been able to achieve yet. And we're actually putting in place some changes that are modeled after the way the British have been doing civil-military relations for quite a while. So let me continue with some of these lessons then. I think the next point is that we need to have an increased focus on measuring the impact of international interventions. Intended impact, as well as what we refer to in the field as unintended consequences. Because some of the consequences that we hope for are not realized, and then oftentimes interventions will have a panoply of unintended consequences, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. And so the hope is, by studying impact more clearly, that we can begin to understand how to mitigate negative unintended consequences. So some of the work I've been doing has attempted to differentiate among types of impact. So for example, looking at intervention, among different types. So for example, we would look at functional impact, political impact, societal impact, strategic impact, to begin to try to delineate more clearly the types of impact that interventions make in the host governments and in the host societies. I mean, remember, our policies and interventions impact lives in other countries. And arguably, the interventions that we make are not just to increase our security, but to hopefully increase the security of other populations. And so we need to ask questions not only about, is this enhancing American security, but is this enhancing the security of the lives of the people who we impact in the field? Let me use the example of Afghanistan. It's never really been clear what the benchmarks are for measuring success in Afghanistan, nor for exiting the country. Without any clear coordination among actors or an agreement on the conditions for success, the benchmarks and strategies have been moving targets. So we now hear and read about counterinsurgency. And this is defined in the literature typically as defeating the Taliban, the insurgents, by bolstering the government and security forces, by winning local support, by reintegrating and reconciling former combatants and insurgents, and also nation building in terms of developing the economy. No problem, right? Now, this is currently the focus for NATO and the US. I found helpful recently an article that was in the National Journal. This was published in June of 2011, and the title is "Washington Losing Patience with Counterinsurgency in Afghanistan." So this strategy of clear, hold, and build towns and villages while killing off insurgents is trying to strike a balance between war fighting and nation building. Some would say, though, counterinsurgency is too little too late. We needed a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan in the early years of the war. And trying to implement this 6 to 8 years later, when the insurgency has actually grown in strength, when there's been more resistance to the occupation, is counterproductive. The military focus is to try to win hearts and minds. You've heard this phrase used quite often. But this is a difficult process without any clear measures for success. Military experts, as well as scholars, are divided on whether counterinsurgency is succeeding or whether it's failing. Some criticize it for savage tactics of relying on covert killing by aerial drones and special operation teams. In Afghanistan, it's applied mostly in the south and southwest, where the population is approximately 2.1 million. But there are 14 provinces in the east of Afghanistan, which total more than half the total population of Afghanistan, which is 30 million. So more than half the population is really not being focused with counterinsurgency operations. It's being largely ignored, mostly because of the fact that we're overstretched in terms of our resources. And we don't have time to really get into this. Maybe we can explore it further later. But in order to succeed in Afghanistan, whatever success means, we haven't really clearly defined it, have we? We also have to address Pakistan. And I think what we see from Pakistan is that the US has continually over-militarized its approach to Pakistan, putting billions of dollars into military assistance without the accompanying aid to education, to the economy, to other areas that would actually help institute long-term value change, which is what we're trying to do in Afghanistan and Pakistan if we take this more holistic approach. Now, whether or not we can succeed, that's an open question. Okay, so building on these two previous points, let me say another word about civil-military cooperation. I do think this is necessary and essential, but international military forces should not assume protracted domestic law enforcement capabilities. A colleague and I have referred to this phenomenon as the militarization of law enforcement, whereby there is a blurring of military and police roles as a spillover effect from the emergence of these complex international interventions. While international military forces are usually the first to arrive if there's a military intervention, they obviously need to prevent a security gap. So in the early phases of a conflict, it is appropriate for the military to assume a law enforcement and police function in order to avoid a security gap. We learned this lesson in Bosnia and in Kosovo, where there were security gaps. And so there's been attention on how to avoid a security gap. Now, we did not learn this lesson in Iraq, did we? I mean, if we think about the early months after the invasion in 2003, I mean, ended up having, a whole-scale meltdown, I think, of the Iraqi military police, but in part because of the choices that we made to disband the Iraqi police and military services without adequately providing reintegration for those forces. And we needed them later. So while international military forces are useful in the initial phases of an operation, over time, we need experts who have experience in police, in customs, in the judiciary, in legal and human rights issues, if we really want to execute a comprehensive approach along the lines of which Secretary Gates has advocated. So, for example, the US military has trained Afghan police officers with questionable effects. The US military has either done the work itself or it's outsourced the training to private security firms, and these firms often lack adequate oversight. So my argument would be that the US military should not train police officers in foreign countries for an extended period of time. This is not work that should be done by the Marines. We're not trained in community police methods, and these are the methods that could be arguably the most worthwhile in a place like Afghanistan. So a comprehensive approach to crisis management and reconstruction, I believe, needs to involve centralized planning with decentralized execution. The absence of coordination in the field isn't always the problem as much as the lack of common planning. And this type of common planning needs to happen in a multi-sector time horizon with a flexible, transparent strategy for conflict transformation. The point to underscore is that conflict transformation and a comprehensive approach go hand in hand. The most challenging aspect is to ensure that an executed plan serves common political and strategic objectives. The problem is that we often haven't identified these common political and strategic objectives. So is it any wonder that it's hard to execute a comprehensive approach in the field? Certainly, when we look at places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, there are national differences to how we approach these issues. Defense spending, development expenditures, traditions of civil-military cooperation. Certainly these national divergences manifest. However, I believe these differences of perspective can be effectively managed with an understanding of the interests, values, and capabilities that each actor brings to the table. And in fact, these different traditions may be an asset depending upon the crisis in question. So let me take a few illustrations that you may not be as familiar with. Aceh, Indonesia, and the Republic of Georgia. In both of these crisis situations, the European Union emerged as the credible actor to facilitate crisis resolution. In both instances, US and UN support for the European Union initiatives strengthened the credibility and dynamism of EU mediation efforts. While EU efforts in Aceh succeeded without qualification, even their more limited aims in Georgia have contributed to truth-telling, to confidence building, and to quelling the conflict between the Georgians and the Russians. The mission there has offered reassurance to not just the Georgians, but to the Russians, and it served an important humanitarian function. The Georgia illustration is an interesting one, I think, because it reminds us that varying degrees of political consensus are possible. European countries were divided on how hard to push back against Russia after the invasion of Georgia. The United States also wasn't in agreement among its various agencies. And yet, everyone was able to agree on the necessity of the EU deploying this monitoring mission. And so the monitoring mission was able to fulfill this very valuable function that no other international organization could have filled if the EU wasn't there. Off the coast of Somalia, the United Nations asked NATO to escort the World Food Program until the EU anti-piracy mission was ready to launch. And I think this is another interesting illustration of the division of labor that's possible among international organizations as well as among state actors. There's enough work to go around. I mean, I think that should be clear by the number of security issues I mentioned at the beginning of my comments. And I think what we see in international politics is that economies and politics of scale drive cooperation. Out of necessity, we are driven to cooperate. Cooperation becomes in our national interest. Let me just mention a couple of other elements I think that Secretary Gates emphasized about international interventions that have an impact on how we think about the way forward. Demobilizing, disarming, and reintegrating armed combatants is a process referred to as DDR. Now, this is essential to securing any peace in a war-ravaged country or a conflict zone. DDR typically doesn't succeed, however, unless it is accompanied by reform of the security and justice sectors. So, or the police and justice sectors. So if you find a way to reintegrate combatants, but you don't actually put into place a functioning police service, if there's no juridical reform, then the conflict could easily erupt again. So what we see repeatedly is that we have to address civilian issues of law enforcement. Again, this whole cycle of police, courts, prisons, everything needs to be addressed if we're really talking about conflict transformation. Now, the international community once again failed to apply the lessons that they identified from Bosnia to both Kosovo and Afghanistan. In both of these conflicts, the reform of the justice sector has lagged far behind the police sector. And I think it's really delayed security and justice in both of these countries. Now, in Libya, there's a need to further pursue DDR now that the rebel forces are going to need to disarm and to reintegrate somehow. So this leads to the next point, that international interveners need grassroots support lest they be perceived and operate as imperial occupiers. This means they have to early on secure political support among local and regional and national officials, and they have to be able to balance competing domestic political interests. Again, we can't talk about intervening without having a political strategy for executing our policies. And all too often, I think we do see a disconnect between the military execution, which is easier because the military has a tradition of planning. This is what they know how to do. But there's often this disconnect between the military and civilian political planning that involves then many different agencies. Let me use the example of Iraq then. Stephen Biddle has pointed out that the Sunni awakening, when Sunni leaders stopped their support of the insurgency, and when they joined the United States in fighting al-Qaeda, that the Sunni awakening ultimately helped turn the tide in Iraq, perhaps more than the surge of US forces, which we typically have heard as the reason why we have succeeded in Iraq. Unfortunately, there's no real natural ally in Afghanistan that is the equivalent of the Sunnis in Iraq. So we're still waiting for this local partner to emerge in Afghanistan to play this constructive role. Now in Libya, I think what's so crucial there is that the intervention had the overwhelming support of the rebels and the Arab League. I mean, that's why there was so much pressure on the United States and Europe to respond. Europe, because it was much more of a security issue because it was so close to Europe in terms of the geographical boundaries. But because the Arab League was turning to the United States and Europe and saying, we're on the verge of a humanitarian disaster. Genocide is going to occur. So given that the United States and its allies had occupied Iraq and Afghanistan, and then were receiving calls from the Arab League to not intervene in Libya would have given the perception of pure national interest driving the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. There was this tremendous humanitarian pressure to respond to Libya, in part because of the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think this leads to the next point that builds on everything else I've said in reference to Secretary Gates' perspective, is using the leverage and strategies of smart power, that concept that I introduced by Joseph Nye. It's a concept that Secretary Clinton has emphasized. There was a cover, I can't remember if it was Newsweek, where she's on the cover and it says smart power because she's picked up this term by Joseph Nye, and she's saying that the hallmark of foreign assistance and U.S. aid work overseas will then be based upon smart power strategies. And I think smart power is helpful because it also emphasizes the need for modest ambitions. It doesn't say that we can't intervene and focus on building the economy or democracy or having an impact on the rights of women. But it does remind us that nation building is extraordinarily difficult. And it is based upon the idea that there has to be a broad coalition of international support for international interventions to possess legitimacy. In both Bosnia and Kosovo, there's the prospect of future membership in both the European Union and NATO. Now, this serves as a very important leverage for reform. Unfortunately, this integrative potential is missing outside of the Balkans. Yet, there is still leverage and influence that can be exercised. And that's possible through our aid, through diplomacy, through training, incentives, what is called smart power. This needs to be pursued in Syria, for example, by pressuring the current regime via countries in the region who share similar US and European perspectives to halt the brutality against civilians. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a UN security resolution given the veto exercised by 2 of the 15 members. But that doesn't mean that we don't have leverage to exercise. And I think that takes us back then to considering smart power strategies. In Libya, by ensuring that oil wealth is used to rebuild the country, we can ensure that it doesn't become what is referred to as a resource curse, breeding corruption, instability, and conflict. So we need to think creatively about how to use leverage, including in the oil sector in Libya, in terms of trying to stabilize post-Gaddafi Libya. So the challenges, I think, of Iraq and Afghanistan should not lead us to the conclusion that there's no role for the military in the world, nor should we conclude that there's no place for military intervention, but it should provoke a reexamination of assumptions, policies, and priorities. While the capture and death of bin Laden was achieved through the military instrument, the major successes in counterterrorism will continue to come from utilizing civilian methods of law enforcement and human intelligence, not necessarily from the military instrument or even counterinsurgency methods. I think this point is underscored in the new Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review that was launched last year in 2011 by Secretary Clinton. The way forward is development, diplomacy, and security, where the military instrument is subordinate to state and U.S. aid. Now, of course, the ability to put this into place will be contingent upon all of those agencies being able to work this out in practice. Democracy isn't established in foreign lands by typically deploying thousands of foreign troops. Democracy takes root and flourishes endogenously, although it is sometimes assisted from exogenous forces. But it definitely has to come from having support from within the country. So in conclusion, I believe we know what many of the lessons are from international interventions and non-intervention. We don't lack knowledge so much as the unwillingness to institute some of the policies and strategies that would be necessary for changing our actual practice. As I've said on multiple occasions already, it's about turning rhetoric into reality and developing the actual strategies necessary to executing a smart power approach to global security. Now, Joseph Nye reminds us in his book that the United States would be wise to, quote, try encouraging the gradual evolution of democracy, but in a manner that accepts the reality of diversity. The United States needs fewer Wilsonian calls to make the world safe for democracy, unless combined with Kennedy's rhetoric of, quote, making the world safe for diversity. We have lessons identified from nearly 2 decades of post-Cold War interventions. The challenge is to apply the lessons of the past to ongoing and future operations. I think otherwise the alternative is that international interventionists with good intentions unwittingly prolong or exacerbate insecurity for the very citizens that they're trying to assist, wasting time and resources, and in other words, sacrificing blood and treasure. Secretary Gates wisely reminds us in his speech in 2010 at the Eisenhower Library that, quote, what is required going forward is not more study. Now, that's probably a funny thing for an academic to say, right? He says, nor do we need more legislation. It's not really a great mystery what needs to change. What it takes is the political will and willingness to make hard choices, choices that will displease the powerful inside the Pentagon and outside the Pentagon. So most importantly, the logic of a persistent state of global warfare should be replaced, I think, with a narrative of smart power. So that's where I would leave us for our discussion, is thinking more critically about what this narrative of smart power might look like. Thank you.